cameras are complicated. I was frustrated with my first DSLR. I couldn't capture what I saw through my viewfinder. It took a ton of trial and error to improve my photography. When I managed to work it all out, I started taking some pretty spectacular images. This photography for beginners guide will share with you everything that I've learned from my mistakes. How do cameras work? As beginner photographers, we tend to be visual learners, and it's my job to make beginners photography as easy as possible for you. So I thought to myself, what better way to help beginner photographers learn how to use their cameras than by creating an infographic? And that's exactly what I did. I collaborate with an illustrator friend of mine, and together we made those images. The following are something that will make understanding exposure and how cameras work a whole lot easier. Check out what we came up with below. Exposure. For those beginning photography, exposure is key to capturing a great image. Learning how exposure works will help you to take control of your camera and take better photos. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are the elements that combine to create an exposure. As you will soon learn, these elements have an effect on more than the exposure. They also cause alternations in depth of field, motion blur, and digital noise. Once you understand how each one works, you can start diving into manual mode. This is where you take control back from your camera. The exposure triangle is a great way to remember the three settings. When combined, they control the amount of light captured from the given scenes. This will help you to understand that changing one setting will need a change in the others. That is if you are photographing the same scenes with the same exact lighting conditions. Read here for all the information you need on the exposure triangle. Aperture. Exposure happens in 3 steps. We will start with the aperture. This is the hole inside the lens through which the light passes. It's similar to the pupil of your eye. The wider the aperture, the more light in the allowed in, and vice versa. Simple, not quite. As the aperture widens, the f number gets lower and more light is allowed into the camera. This is great for low light, but be aware that is going to make the depth of field very shallow. This is not ideal when taking landscape photos. So this is a short summary, but I go into full details about that in this post. The aperture is the preferred setting to set first, as it directly influences how much of your sense is in focus. But if you are looking to create motion blur, then it's second to the shutter speed. Exposure will be much easier if you can memorize the f-stop scale. The scale is as follows: F number 1.4, F number 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and F number 22. Shutter speed. Once light has passed through the aperture of the lens, it reaches the shutter. Now, we need to decide how much of that light you're going to allow into the camera. Ordinarily, you only want a very small fraction of the second. For example, 1 by 250 to prevent motion blur. However, different shutter speeds complement different situations. Anything from really fast 1 by 4000 for sports photography to really slow 30 seconds. For night photography, it all depends on what you are shooting and how much light you have available to you. Knowing how your shutter speed works is a key element in the basics of photography. ISO. Once the light has passed through the aperture and been filtered by the shutter speed, it reaches the sensor. This is where we decide how to set the ISO. As you turn the ISO number up, you increase the brightness, but at the same time, the image quality decreases. There will be more digital noise or grain. So you have to decide upon your priorities in times of exposure versus the gain. For example, I would reduce the image quality if it meant that I could prevent motion blur in my photo. There is no possible way to fix that in post-production, yet at least. Exposure summary. Once you have understand the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you need to learn how each of these elements of exposure work together. For all those basics of photography, exposure is the most important. If you don't have this down, composition and framing become a moot point in beginner photography. In this post, you will learn about the stop-based system for measuring exposure, and you will also learn how to prioritize the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO for the best photo.